One of the first things I learned as a trucker is that you can't always count on cell service. Whether it's because you're driving through bad weather and the cell towers are down, or simply because you're in a part of the country with spotty service, something can always go wrong. That's why trucks come equipped with state-of-the-art radio systems to communicate with other drivers on the road and anyone else we might need to get a hold of. They're really important in emergency situations. That's why I didn't know what to do when mine was actually causing my emergency. I was driving through Nebraska on a small highway in the middle of nowhere. It was about 6 p.m. and the sun had just started to set. I let my mind drift off and I listened to the rumbling noise of the engine that was pulling me along. I decided to pull off to the side of the road for a few minutes to enjoy a small meal and call my wife before getting back on the road. The only problem was that I didn't have any cell reception. I decided to send my wife a text, assuming that she would get it when I was back in service, and then started eating the sandwich that I picked up earlier that day. I looked out the windshield of the rig I was driving, but the darker it got outside, the less I could see. Suddenly, I felt a chill in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my skin start to crawl. What's going on? I thought to myself as I looked around. As I said, I couldn't see much, so I decided to flip on my headlights to calm myself down. There was nothing around me, but for the life of me, I couldn't shake that strange feeling. I decided to wrap up my meal and hit the road again, just to be safe. But no more than 2 minutes after pulling the truck back on the road, I heard the click of my truck's CB radio, as if someone was trying to get through to me. I picked up the microphone to see if anyone was trying to patch through, but before I could speak, I heard a voice. "Where are you going?" it asked. I didn't recognize the tone of the person speaking to me, so I knew it wasn't anyone from the company I worked with. I asked them who I was speaking to, but I was only met with silence. I figured it was just some sort of prank. But about a minute later, I heard the voice again. "I still see you," said the low-pitched voice. My hand gripped the steering wheel even tighter as my mind raced. I tried to find a logical explanation for who I was talking to, but I kept coming up blank. Must have just been a prankster, I thought to myself. But that was when the person on the other end of the CB started to describe my truck. "You're in a cherry red Mack truck, carrying lumber to the Bayside freight yard." He even knew my license plate number. I started looking in all of my mirrors to see if I was being followed, but to my surprise, the road was still empty. A feeling of terror washed over me as I tried to figure out who this person was and how they knew how to contact me. I looked over to my phone, which was sitting on the dashboard, wondering if I should call for help, but then I remembered that there was no cell phone service. I couldn't get help even if I wanted to. I continued driving down the road as calmly as possible, just waiting for the voice to speak again. I unintentionally started to speed up. Must have been my nerves because I didn't even notice. He did, though. "Why are you running? You don't think you can escape me, do you?" the voice said. I could feel my palms getting sweaty as they gripped the steering wheel. All I could do was continue to drive. A few minutes went by and there was no sign of the voice, which helped to calm me down a bit. But every time I checked my phone, it would say no service, and I couldn't help but feel a pit of dread forming in my stomach. 20 more minutes passed as I drove down that highway, and I thought I was in the clear, but then my heart almost stopped as I heard the CB radio click. "That was a fun time, wasn't it? Until we speak again," the voice said calmly before being cut off by static. As soon as the voice went away, I looked over to my phone and noticed that my cell phone signal was back. I called my boss as soon as I could, told her what happened to me, and asked if there was anyone in the warehouse who could have been messing with me. She was just as confused as I was, though. To this day, I still haven't figured out how that person got onto my frequency and knew so much about my truck. But the only thought that keeps me calm on the road is that it must have been a prankster or something. That's the only logical explanation that doesn't shake me to my core. It was just after 5 in the morning, and I just got on my rig and hit the road for the day. I loved the start of my shifts because the sun usually wasn't up yet, so the roads were usually clear. However, that day was a little different. As I drove down the side road leading away from the company that I worked for, I noticed that there was another rig on the side of the road. I didn't recognize the truck or the person standing outside of it, but I decided to pull over in front of him and see if he needed help. The man was standing near the back of his trailer, looking at the ground as if something had fallen out of it. I called out to see if he needed any help, and he explained that he was driving down the road and noticed that his trailer had popped itself open, and asked if I had seen anything in the middle of the road that might have been his cargo. I told him that I hadn't, but I had no problem pulling out a flashlight and looking around. I pulled my light out of my pocket and started shining it around the sides of the road, but as soon as my back was to the man, I regretted it. I felt something small and pointy stick into the back of my neck before electricity started coursing through my body. I'd been tased, and my body had basically collapsed onto the floor. I wasn't unconscious, so I could feel the man flip me over and drag me toward the back of his truck. Once we were there, he hoisted me up and forced me into the trailer. By the time I was forced inside, I was regaining some of my strength. I swung my arm toward the man with my fist, ready for impact, but the man ducked the punch and then jabbed the taser into the side of my ribcage. My body seized up and I collapsed onto the floor of the trailer. Darkness started to pool around me as the trailer door slammed shut, and I cried out for help as I heard the man locking them from the outside. The truck started up, and I could feel the road under the wheels as I tried to lean myself up against the walls of the truck. It took me a minute to shake off the daze from the taser, but once I did, I quickly remembered that I had my cell phone. I pulled it out and called 911 to explain what was going on. It was hard for the dispatcher to hear me with all the noise from the truck, but I explained to him where I was assaulted and taken from, and he assured me that help was on the way. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher for the next 10 minutes or so, pleading for him to help, but there was still no sign of any cops around. That was when I could feel the truck starting to slow down. We turned onto a much bumpier road that was forcing the driver to go much slower. I explained this to the dispatcher, and as I felt the truck come to a stop, I asked him for help one last time, and then hung up the phone. I didn't want my assailant to see my cell phone and take it from me. I could hear the man dragging his feet as he slowly walked toward the back of the truck to unlock it. As he unlocked the door, I reminded myself that he had a taser, and that if I wanted to get away, I had to watch out for it. The door swung open, and it was like a flashbang of light. I couldn't let it disturb me too much, though, because I knew I only had a few seconds, otherwise I would be tased and helpless again. I waited until the man was leaning into the trailer to step inside, and when he did, I took my chance. I kicked my right leg toward his head, which made him fall back a bit, and I took the opportunity to run and jump out of the trailer. I managed to jump clear over the man, who was still recovering from the kick that he avoided, and as soon as my feet touched the ground, I took off. I ran as fast as I could in the direction that we came from, and at the same time I fumbled for my phone and called 911 back. I described my surroundings to the dispatcher, who told me that the police were about 2 minutes away from me and to just remain calm. I stashed myself behind a tree and kept an eye on the road as I hoped my assailant didn't find me. The 2 minutes took forever to pass, but eventually I was relieved to see the flashing red and blue lights coming up the road. The officers found the truck that I had been forced into abandoned where I escaped from it, and the driver was nowhere to be found. Officers searched the area for hours but couldn't find him. That was hands down the scariest experience of my life, and every time I'm out on the road, I wonder if I'm going to see that man again. It was my 4th year as a truck driver, and I was making a delivery in relatively bad weather. I could hardly see anything in front of me because of how thick the fog was. I kept my eyes fixated on the road and made sure to drive slower than I usually would, just in case I needed to come to a quick stop. And I'm glad I did, because as I was making my way down a soft bend, I was forced to slam on the brakes and jerk the wheel to avoid hitting a woman who was walking right in the middle of the street. I screamed at the top of my lungs as she appeared in front of me, but she didn't flinch as the truck narrowly missed her. My heart was racing as I came to a complete stop and parked the truck on the side of the road. I tried to regain my composure before stepping out into the thick fog. I called out for the woman to see if she was okay, as I started running up the road looking for her. But as I got farther and farther away from my truck, I couldn't help but notice that there was no sign of her. A sense of confusion washed over me as I looked around. I couldn't make any sense out of what just happened. Did I imagine it? I wondered as I slowly walked back to my truck, but by the time I got there, I realized that I couldn't have been. I had to squint my eyes to see exactly what it was, but as I got closer to my truck, I noticed that there was someone inside of it. I walked up to the cab and opened the door, only to see the woman that I had almost hit sitting in the driver's seat, fumbling around looking for the keys. She had never been in a big rig before because she couldn't see that the keys were already in the ignition. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Are you all right?" That was when I heard another person start talking from behind me. It was a man this time, and all he said was, "Yeah, she's fine, man, but you won't be if you don't give us the keys." I turned around and was practically blinded by a flashlight in my face. I put my hand over my eyes to cover them from the light, but when I did that, I felt the man try to hit me over the head with the light he was using. "Did you hear me, man?" he yelled. "Where are the keys?" I didn't want to lose my job, but I didn't want to lose my life, so I told him that they were still in the truck. The guy pushed me to the side and quickly made his way into the truck, forcing the woman over and into the passenger seat. I thought that I was in the clear as the truck started to pull off, and I figured that I would just call my boss and then the police to explain what happened. But that was when I saw the muzzle flash. 3 gunshots were fired from the driver's side window of my truck, and even though they had all missed me, I dropped to the ground out of fear. I don't know if the man thought that he had hit and killed me, but after that, he and the woman pulled away in my truck and left me lying on the pavement. When I got the chance, I called the police and reported my truck stolen before calling my boss, who sent another driver out to pick me up after the police took my statement. We never saw that truck again, but my boss swears that they're just happy that I made it out alive. I was driving down a route that I had taken over a dozen times to get this shipment from Texas to Arkansas overnight. The truck I was driving was new to me because my personal cab was in the shop, so I was being extra careful and a bit slow as I got used to how this one drove. I expected that though. That's why I left the yard an hour early that day. If I hadn't, I probably would have been a little late with the shipment, but that's nothing compared to what ended up happening. It was almost midnight as I made my way down the dark and empty street. I kept my eyes glued to the road and only ever looked away to check that I was making a decent pace, but because there were hardly any other vehicles out at that time, it usually wasn't a problem. However, as I was making my way down a long stretch of straight road, I looked over to my GPS and then back to the road, only to notice something strange in the middle of the street. I immediately started to slow down as I tried to figure out what I could have possibly been looking at. From a distance, it looked like whatever it was took up the entire street from side to side. I slowed the truck as much as I could without coming to a complete stop, because I figured that it was probably just rubber from a blown-out tire strewn across the street. As I got closer though, I realized that it wasn't a blown-out tire at all. I gasped as I recognized that 2 people were lying in a straight line across the street. I knew I didn't have time to stop all the way, so I veered off to the shoulder of the road, and I continued to step on the brake. Thankfully, I avoided hitting either of the people, and managed to bring the truck to a stop about 20 to 30 feet away from where they were laying. I took a second to breathe and calm myself down before stepping out of the truck to check on the 2 people. I couldn't fathom why they would be lying in the middle of the road, so I knew I had to check if they were okay. I wish I hadn't though. I hopped out of the truck and quickly ran over to the 2 people who were now in a seated position and trying to get up from the ground. "Are you okay?" I asked them as I ran over, but they didn't answer at first. I got right up to the person who was closest to me and extended my hand out to help them up. They had different plans in mind though. They grabbed my hand, and as they pulled themselves up, they used the momentum and leverage to pull me down to the ground. Before I even realized what happened, I was on the ground, and the 2 of them were now standing over me. I couldn't quite make out their faces because of how dark it was, but I could tell that they were both young men. I tried to talk to them and ask them what was going on. but instead of answering, they just looked down at me. I looked up at the two of them and wondered how I could possibly get back to my truck safely, but I couldn't think of a way. I was going to try talking to them again, but as I started to open my mouth, I felt something hard hit me in the back of the neck. The force pushed me forward, and my head almost smacked into the pavement, but I was able to put my hands out before that happened. I turned to see what had hit me, and that was when I saw a third person standing over me. They must have come out from the side of the road and snuck up on me. This time, I was facing him when the gun that he had in his hand came swinging at my head. I heard a crack and winced as it hit my nose. I started feeling dizzy and my vision began to blur as I tried to ask them what they wanted again. But I didn't get all of the words out before I collapsed. I could feel myself passing out as they began rummaging through my pockets. I kept telling myself in my head that I needed to get up and that I couldn't die there. But what was truly terrifying was how helpless I was. There was nothing I could do as I lay in the middle of the street that night. And the last thing I remember hearing before passing out was the cocking of a gun. I thought that was it. I was dead. And then everything faded to black. I was surprised a little while later when I was woken up by an EMT who was helping me into the back of an ambulance. I asked them what happened and if I had been shot. They smiled and told me that I was going to be fine. After I passed out, it seems like they took my truck and left me in the middle of the road. The EMT also told me that it was a random driver who found me. He saw me passed out in the middle of the road, and just like I had done, he stopped to help out. There was an investigation into the missing truck, and my job was put on hold for a month, but eventually I was back in my own rig, and everything was business as usual. About 2 years into my career as a truck driver, I ended up having 2 weeks where I spent every night in a motel instead of my truck because I was too freaked out about what happened that last time I was at a truck stop. I eventually got over it and everything was fine, but that was only after convincing myself I would never stay at that specific truck stop again. And I know that might sound ridiculous, but I've never been more scared in my entire life than I was on that night. It was the middle of the summer, and I was driving a shipment from Louisiana to West Virginia. As I started to get tired, I began looking for a rest stop for that night. The one I ended up at was empty when I got there, and I took that as a sign that I was going to have a nice, quiet night. I was actually excited to get some good sleep after being on the road all day, so as soon as I parked, I basically got ready for bed. I locked the doors and made sure everything was secure before pulling my blackout curtains shut and lying down. And I was asleep within a couple of minutes. Now, I'm used to being woken up in the middle of the night by loud noises, like trucks starting or people slamming doors. So at first, I didn't think anything of it when I heard a loud bang outside of the truck that woke me up. I didn't even sit up right away when I heard it because I thought it was something normal. However, as I was lying there, I noticed a strange sort of tapping sound that almost sounded like it was coming from the other side of my cab. I slowly sat up and continued to listen to the tapping, and by that point, I was almost positive that someone was tapping on the door of my truck. I stood up and prepared myself to look out of the window and see who was there, but when I poked my head out of the back of the cab, I didn't see anything. I looked out both the driver's and the passenger side window, but there was nothing there. What was even weirder was that there was also no one else at the rest stop still. It seemed like I was there by myself. I sat back down on the bed in the back of the cab and tried to figure out what I could have been hearing, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure it out. I tried to let it go and just lay back down, but as soon as my head hit the pillow, that sound was back. Only this time, it was accompanied by the sound of scraping metal. I didn't waste time because now I thought someone was damaging my truck. So I hopped out of the bed, stepped right into the front of the cab, and looked out. But once again, I couldn't see anything. But what was weirder was the feeling of grief that came over me when I went to open the door. I wanted to go outside and check on the load in the back to make sure that no one had messed with it. But for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to do it right away. I had my hand on the door handle for a good 2 minutes before I finally opened it, and as soon as I stepped out of the truck, I no longer felt like I was alone in that parking lot. I kept looking at my shoulder as I felt like someone was watching me, but no matter where I looked, I couldn't see anything. I even checked underneath the trailer to see if someone was hiding underneath there, but there was nothing. I made my way to the back of the trailer to make sure that it was still locked, and when I saw it was secure, I quickly walked back to the front end. I planned on rushing right inside, but as I walked past the side of the trailer, I noticed something that wasn't there before. I ended up grabbing a flashlight to see it better, but it looked like someone or something had dragged something sharp across the side of it. I looked around again as I started getting the sense that someone was watching me again, but when I couldn't see anything, I just ran back into the truck. I locked the door again and tried my best to relax, but every little sound that I heard made me jump. I was too on edge to rest anymore that night, so I decided to just make some instant coffee and hit the road once I was more awake. The strangest thing about that night for me was when I was sitting in the driver's seat though. As I turned the truck on and got ready to pull out of the rest stop, I couldn't get comfortable. It was like I was afraid to look out the window for fear of seeing whatever it was that had been tormenting me. And at one point, I could feel myself physically shaking. Needless to say, I got out of the rest stop as fast as I could and made my way over to the nearest gas station before running all my daily checks on the truck and then starting my delivery. That entire day, though, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange tapping and scraping noise, and eventually, it got to the point where I had freaked myself out so much that I couldn't force myself to stay in the truck. Thankfully, I got over it eventually, but to this day, thinking back on that night gives me chills. In my first year as a trucker, I used to be baffled by the amount of stories I would hear about people trying to rob delivery drivers and take their shipments. There was even a period of time when I was permitted to have a firearm in the cab with me, just in case of an emergency. Thankfully, I never had to use it. That doesn't mean that I never saw my fair share of scary moments, though. Honestly, the worst thing that ever happened to me was during a job that had me driving all across New York State over the course of a week, taking shipments from one warehouse to another. I'll never forget it. About halfway through the week, I ended up staying at a rest stop just outside of Syracuse. I was surprised at how nice it was, and because of how many other truckers were there, I thought it was a pretty safe spot to park overnight. Boy, was I wrong. I cooked some dinner on a hot plate that I always brought with me, and then packed everything up before heading to bed for the night. But as I was locking the doors and closing up the windows, I noticed that there were a few people hanging out near the restrooms. I couldn't tell if they were with anyone, and because I was paranoid, I decided to hop out of the truck and double-check that the shipment was locked in the back. Everything was good, and I went to bed thinking that it would be fine. But before I could even get to sleep, I started to hear what I knew were footsteps walking around the outside of my truck. I sat up and started to put my shoes on, and got ready to confront what I thought would be people messing with my truck. But once I didn't hear anyone talking or anything, I figured that they were just walking by. I laid back down and fell asleep for a while before I woke up to the unmistakable sound of someone opening the back of my trailer. I got out of bed and figured I would let them know that I heard them before confronting them so that they would hopefully run off, and it worked. I turned the truck lights on, and as soon as they realized someone was awake in the cab, they all ran for it. I watched out the driver's side window as they all ran toward the woods that surrounded the sides of the truck stop, but I made sure to wait a minute before getting out to close the trailer, just to be safe. Once I figured that it was clear, I quickly ran out of the cab and toward the back of the trailer. Before I had gotten all the way there, though, I could hear the sound of people talking. I heard someone yell out, "He's right there! We should go now!" I knew I couldn't waste any time. I rushed over to the back of the truck and slammed the trailer shut before sprinting back to the cab. I could hear the sound of people running toward the truck, and as I hopped inside and closed the door, I felt one of them grab onto it and try to stop me. I used all my strength to pull it shut and managed to lock it before they could force it open. I reached into the back of the cab where I was sleeping and grabbed my keys before starting my truck. The entire time I was doing so, I was being bombarded by the sound of the people outside pounding on the windows as if they were trying to break them. I managed to get the truck started and to pull out of the parking spot that I was in just in time, because as I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and could see one of the attackers carrying a large stone that they were going to use to break through the window and get me out of the truck. To this day, I don't know if they wanted to steal the truck or simply rob me, but I'm glad I made it out of that rest stop.